This video is going to have a look at the Truman Doctrine and the Marshal Plan, which are two key American policies during the Cold War, which all, in essence, are part of that policy of containment, that desire to contain the spread of communism. We'll also have a look at the Truman Doctrine, named after US President Harry Truman. Remember, he had led the negotiations with Stalin at Potsdam. He's seen as a much tougher president than Roosevelt was. He's certainly much tougher and much more confrontational when it comes to dealing with Stalin. So in 1947, he does a speech and he declares that America needs to contain the spread of communism across the world, that it's a global problem that needs to be sorted by the United States of America. It's partly in response to the formation of the satellite states. It's in response to that formation of countries over here, which are now led by communist governments, although technically independent from the Soviet Union, that are controlled from Moscow. And remember, this was in direct opposition to what Stalin had agreed on. Stalin had agreed that there would be free and fair elections in Eastern Europe after 1945, and that didn't happen. The Soviet Red Army was used either directly or indirectly to assist communist takeovers of those countries. So, Truman declares that the USA would give support to any country that was threatened by communism. Any country in the world that's a capitalist country that's threatened by communism would be eligible to receive support from the USA. This could include a combination of weapons, money, or even US soldiers. So it could be military, it could be economic, it could be in material, it could be in men, depending on the situation. This is the policy of containment at work. And Truman begins this by supporting Greek capitalists. So Greece, just down here, is fighting a civil war. There's Greek capitalists fighting a civil war against the communists since 1945. Since the end of the Second World War, the communists have been given support from the Soviet Union in order to try and take over the country. Now, Greece is really, really important strategically, and initially Britain had been bankrolling this. So Britain had been supporting the Greek government in their fight against the communists. However, after the Second World War, Britain was bankrupt and could no longer afford to do this. And so when we turned to the Americans and we said we can no longer afford to fund the Greek capitalists, Truman stepped in and he began to pay for the weapons and the ammunition that they needed to fight against the communists. Now, the reason why Greece is so important is that along with Turkey, it controls the entrance into the Black Sea here, which is obviously part of the coastline of the Soviet Union. If Greece is controlled by a capitalist country, we could deny the Black Sea fleet, so a fleet of Russian ships, the ability to leave the Black Sea effectively. You could blockade it through this strip here, through the Dardanelles. So that's why it's really, really important that it doesn't turn communist. And of course, we have seen these Eastern European countries gradually turn communist. So it's really important to the Americans that they make a stand with Greece and they stop it from turning communist. In addition to this, the USA is also going to lead a military intervention during the Korean War in 1950. So Korea, at the end of the Second World War, had been divided in half. In essence, the Soviets had come down from the north and the Americans had come up from the south, from Japan, and they'd met on the 48th parallel, which divided Korea effectively in half, and it had agreed that that's where they'd stop. The Americans had basically stopped Soviet expansion by putting soldiers in the way. The end result of that was a communist government in the north and a capitalist government in the south. In 1950, the Soviet Union gave backing to the Koreans, or to the North Koreans rather, to try and unify Korea. So they invaded. They were almost successful. They almost conquered all of South Korea until a US-led United Nations force counterattacked and would ultimately recapture South Korea and have the status quo that we have even today, a communist north and a capitalist south. These were both examples of differing forms of containment, but both ways that the USA stopped communism from spreading. So it's designed to make the USA look strong because they're going to confront the USSR. Remember, in the long telegram, George Kennan had said the Soviets could be stopped, that communism could be stopped from spreading if the USA was willing to be tough. and was willing to stand up to Stalin and confront him. However, the aim is to avoid fighting the USSR directly. They don't want World War III. They don't want to start a huge war 2 years after they've just ended the Second World War. So they want to avoid direct fighting. So even in Korea, there is no direct fighting between the USA and the USSR. We know now that the Soviets did send some pilots to Korea, but at the time that wasn't known. And Stalin was also very clear that they wanted to avoid a war. So all of these methods, the Truman Doctrine, is about stopping that spread of communism, but ideally by doing it without using US soldiers to fight. And if US soldiers are required to fight, not using them to fight the Soviets directly. There's also the Marshal Plan. So in 1947, most of Europe is still devastated after the Second World War. And we can see that in some of the images here. And particularly across Europe, the carpet bombing of European cities by the RAF and the US Air Force had completely destroyed them. Okay, factories had been destroyed, homes had been destroyed, the economy was weak. And the USA understands that countries that have a poor economy, that haven't got a large income, are much more likely to turn to communism. Now, the reason for this, in essence, is that if you don't have anything to lose, communism is very appealing. So if your factory's been destroyed and you don't have a house, if the communists turn to you and say, we will ensure that you have a job and we will ensure that you have a house and that everyone has the same, that's appealing because actually you're gaining. If, however, you've got a good job and you own your own house and you are earning a decent amount of money, if someone turns to you and says, we are going to take all of that from you and redistribute to everybody else, that's much less appealing. You're not actually going to want to turn communist if that's the case. And so the USA decided to distribute Marshall Aid, named after Secretary of State George Marshall. Basically, the plan of this is to give Europe loans. About $17 billion, more than $129 billion in 2020. This could be used to rebuild their economy. So these countries could build factories, they could rebuild their infrastructure, they could build new roads and new railways and ensure that people could go back to making money. And then they'd start trading and they'd start selling things, hopefully back to the US, and they'd buy US goods. And all of a sudden, the economies would boom. Well, that was the hope. In Britain, for example, we use a lot of this money to pay for the National Health Service. But again, it gave people a stake in that country. Okay, and they thought it would be a really effective way of containing communism. Okay, the money was even offered to Eastern European countries, so satellite states, because remember, they're not actually part of the Soviet Union, but they are controlled by it. So the USA tried to offer them money, the idea being that it would foster capitalism and then these countries might have a capitalist government instead. But Moscow, so Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union in Moscow, forbids them from accepting it. He says, you are not allowed to accept this money. But it's a really effective way of stopping Western Europe from becoming communist, simply because it builds up the capitalist system, it gives people in those Western European economies something to lose from communism, and therefore makes them much more supportive of capitalism. So the USA looks really powerful. They've shown they can use their economic power to support European countries. It also shows that they're actually serious about stopping communism. And up until this point, the USA had really been all talk. They'd not done anything. But by actually distributing this Marshall Aid money, they're showing Europe that they mean what they say, that the Truman Doctrine is not just words, that they will do something to stop communism, which makes European countries believe they can rely on the USA. Now, the USSR looks weak. They can't actually offer the satellite states the same levels of economic investment because the Soviet economy is poor. Okay, the Soviet Union is a much, much poorer country than the USA, so they can't offer the same package. And actually what it does is it makes communism look far less appealing. From two perspectives. First of all, from the West, communism looks much less appealing because any images they see of Eastern Europe, it looks much poorer and their living standards are much worse. And for Eastern Europeans, it's actually quite unappealing to them now because their living standards are poor and Western living standards are high. So it makes them want capitalism as well. So it cuts both ways for the USA. Now, the Soviet response. Stalin is furious. He thinks the USA is trying to take control of countries across Europe, and he labels it dollar imperialism. He thinks that this is an example of that world domination the Novikov telegram had warned about. Now, what the Soviets do in response is they form two organizations. The first one, Cominform, 1947, stands for the Communist Information Bureau. Basically, it organizes all the communist parties in Europe and it arranges their leadership so that they would do what Moscow told them to do. The idea was that this included Western Europe as well. So the idea behind that was they would control all the communist parties and would hopefully allow them to facilitate revolutions in these countries to spread communism further. It also increased Soviet control over Eastern Europe. It gave the Soviets far more direct control over those satellite states. So remember, the satellite states are independent, but their governments do what they're told by Moscow, and this increases their control. What they also then form is Comecon in 1949, and this is a direct, well, I say a direct 2 years later, but it's an alternative to the Marshal Plan. It's a direct reaction to it. It stands for the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. It basically develops trade links between the USSR and the satellite states, but crucially forbids them from accepting Marshall aid. So it does provide a bit of an economic boost. However, it's not as beneficial as Marshall aid, as you can only trade between those countries. The standard of product in those countries is also quite poor. Remember, in communism, you don't have that competition that you have in capitalism. So there's no incentive for companies to build bigger and better things. And so therefore, it is a bit of a benefit for those countries, but it's not as good as Marshall aid. But again, it does give them increased control, which of course is good for Stalin and his buffer zone. But that's a Soviet response to this. So the Americans have set out a plan to contain the spread of communism. The Soviets have responded. Cominform, they hope, will spread revolutions across Europe, and Comecon, they hope, will keep control of those Eastern European countries and keep them happy, economically speaking.